What a pleasure. I'm so glad to interview you, Jamey Aebersold. Thank you so much for being here.
Delighted to be here, Donna.
This is fantastic. I was just thinking to myself as we called each other for this interview that, oh my gosh, you indirectly have been a part of my life for such a long time. I've had your play along since I was in middle school, not middle school, it's actually junior high school for me. I'm from Long Island. Since I was in what, seventh or eighth grade. And gosh, they've been an integral part of my jazz education. And I know for a lot of my students and my colleagues and peers and whatnot. So I wanted to start off by thanking you for doing this and for starting, the play along series and everything that you do for jazz education.
Well, I appreciate those comments, and I'm sure you probably know the reason I started the play-alongs was to have something to practice with.
Yeah, and it's interesting how what a simple thought, a simple concept has evolved into, well over 100 volumes of play-alongs, as well as, an incredible website with a lot of resources and other play-alongs and other texts and whatnot. So did you, well, this may be obvious, but did you envision that, one play-along that you created back in the day would lead to this?
Not at all. I had planned on putting out one play-along LP in order to have something to practice with, and then it dawned on me that I was going to have to buy probably 500 in order to make it get my money back or whatever. I couldn't make just one. So I said, well, maybe other people would like it. And then once I had the 500, I think I said, well, if people buy this thinking that there's somebody soloing on it, they're going to want their money back. So I better write a book. So then I dove in, and it took me a long time to write a book because I've never really given a lot of thought about improvising and so forth. And that led to the first one. And then I figured if it were good, Berklee School of Music, who at the time were publishing some arrangements and things, I thought if it was a good idea, they would pick it up and have a Berklee School of Music play-alongs. But they didn't do anything with it. And then several years later, I think it was Dan Hurley who said, Jamey, why don't we do a blues one? And then why don't we do a volume 3, the 251? And by that time, we were kind of off and running, and I was still thinking, I need more time to practice if I'm ever going to get my Blue Note record made, this, that, and the other. But the business just kept growing. And then David Baker and Jerry Coker, who I was teaching with in the summer, they came and said, hey, each of them have a book. Would you mind selling that book through your downbeat ad and your camps? And that's basically how I got started. And then 51 years later, I started in 1967. 51 years later, we've got hundreds of books that I've published myself, and we sell thousands of jazz-related items that come from other publishers.
Wow, that's incredible. Let me ask you something with regard to, and this is going to kind of key in or tie into the summer camps. So did the summer camps start around the same time?
Actually, I started doing the summer camps in 1965, and they had been going for about 5 years. Part of it was Stan Kenton for a year or two, but I didn't do those camps. But there was another friend of his called Ken Morris, who was a gambler and a amateur drummer from Indiana, and he invested in the summer jazz workshops, big band. And at one point, I got a scholarship for a week, and that was in the early 60s. And then he asked me if I would join the team as a sectional rehearsal person. I loved doing that because I was I roomed with Ron Carter, and there were just a lot of great people there. That's how I got started, and I did that. Well, I did it for 6 or 7 years, and finally I saw the need at the camps for individual instruction on improvisation. That's what people really wanted. I said, I don't think people really come to the camp to play fourth tenor saxophone and not get to take a solo all week long. Yeah. So I suggested we do the combo camps, and they got started in the early 70s, and they took off. And Ken Morris, who was running the National Stage Band camps at that time, he finally abandoned the big band camp and went with the combo camp. And one summer we had 7 weeks of combo camps, and we've been to Germany, Denmark, Scotland, England, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia, I think. So it really branched out. This need for individual um, tutoring and improvisation was extremely important and needed. And I think I kind of got the thing going.
That's wow, that's really interesting. A thought just occurred to me. Comparing back then, late 60s, early 70s, with now the students of today, I'm just thinking music education itself has changed tremendously. But do you find that the students back then were trained differently? And not just in terms of jazz, but overall, but were trained differently back then than they are now? Like, was their ear training better? Was it not? Those types of things.
I think the answer from my perspective on that is if at a young age, let's say 12, 13, 14, 15, someone directs a student to jazz and they get involved in it, I think the main thing is, you mentioned ear training. The main thing is they start buying records, CDs, and they start listening and they listen and they listen and they listen and they listen. And that is the ear training. And then they incorporate, especially if their teacher encourages this, thinking about things. In other words, what was that phrase that person plays? Was that major? Was it minor? Was that a diminished chord that Sonny Stitt ran up the saxophone on? That last note he held of that phrase, and you thought it was so pretty, was that the root, or was it the third, or was it the sharp four, or maybe it was the sharp nine? In other words, this thinking process intrigued me at an early age because I grew up not thinking at all. It's hard to believe that now. I'm
Yeah.
78, I'll be 79 next month. And I doubt if anybody's thought more about stuff than I've thought, because I have thought and thought and thought. So using the left side of the brain has become very common for me. But when I got up, as a matter of fact, I'll bet I wasn't 27, 28, 29, 30, and I hadn't started really thinking yet. But once I got the play along out and listen to people play, and I'm trying to direct people all around the world who buy the book and the CD, I mean the book and the LP, I'm trying to help them learn how to get the ideas out of their head. And all I've got is words in a book. It really caused me to do a lot of thinking. And then when we started doing the camps, here I'm hearing all of these students play, and a lot of them sound like they're just playing gibberish, and that's because they don't have their instrument under control. So I think your original question was, is learning jazz and teaching it a little different than it was way back there? I think the main thing back there was we had to push the ear training because the book and the reading knowledge wasn't even published yet.
Hmm. Wow. It's interesting that you said that it took until you pretty much wrote the book that you weren't really thinking as much. I'm curious about your background in terms of your own learning of jazz. So how did that work?
Uh, that worked by beating your head up against the wall and playing something over and over and over. And I must admit, for a long time when I was young, I thought people like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Bud Powell and Thelonious Monk, Sonny Stitt, all my heroes, hundreds of them, were kind of born with this ability to do it. And I didn't seem to have it, you know. But then I heard that conversation, which I'm sure you've heard, the interview of where Paul Desmond interviews Charlie Parker. And
Mm.
Charlie says, actually, Paul Desmond asked me, this fantastic technique you had, tell me, how did you get that, you know? And Charlie says, well, I don't think it's so fantastic. I put a lot of work into the hunt. The neighbors were going to ask my mom to move in Kansas City. I was driving crazy. I practiced 11 to 15 hours a day on the saxophone for 3 years. And when I heard that sentence, okay, I was at a 2-day workshop up in Massachusetts, and I played that cassette, that little area right there, back and back. I played it about 4, 5, 6 times. So I said, so that's how all of these great jazz players learned how to play. They practiced. Oh my. So then at that point, I had to decide, well, how far do I want to go with this? Because if I want to go very far, I'm going to have to put in a lot more practice and a lot more thought than what I've been doing. So that kind of got me thinking and practicing more. But when I practiced, I was using the left side of my brain and thinking, what do I need to work on? What do I need to accomplish in order to play these ideas that I hear in my head, you know? And I quickly figured it out. I just needed more hours in the day.
Okay, well now let me have you expand on that though. What at that time, because you didn't have your resources out, there weren't really any play-alongs out there. What did you practice at that time to get you to the level of the playing that you're at?
Uh, I didn't practice what I should practice because I wasn't very well disciplined, and that took me a long time.
Okay.
But I think along the way, over 10, 20, 30 years, and the thinking, when I'm lying in my bed at night, for instance, practicing, or when I was on an airplane, and I'd even get my saxophone out and without the neck and be fingering it for 2 hours while I'm flying across the country or something. I think getting closer, getting the ideas that are in my mind, which are based on scales and chords and intervals and etc., closer to my fingers helped me. So in that regard, I think practicing the instrument and just making the instrument feel more comfortable when my mind would think of a phrase. For instance, back then, to play in C sharp or E flat or A flat or F sharp or B, those were nasty keys for me. I
Mm.
didn't like playing those keys. Now today, I love to play in those keys, but it's only because I think I've given a lot of thought to it. I can sit down in a chair without my instrument and be thinking a solo on giant steps and be fingering the notes. I've just given a lot of thought to it, and I think a lot of people don't give a lot of thought. I think, as a matter of fact, hold on just a second. I just had this open heart surgery 9 weeks ago, and in about the second week, I got this plaque which I have in my hand. It's called it's a beautiful plaque from Jazz on the Tube. You know, a video on the tube.
Yes.
Lifetime Achievement Award, Jamey Aebersold for his incalculable contributions to jazz by demystifying
Mm.
the art of improvisation for musicians young and old around the world. I think that whole idea of demystifying is what I went through. I demystified myself by hearing that cassette of Charlie Parker talking about how much he practiced. And then I relate that to other people. And I say, well, okay, I think I could do that too. And I'll become whoever I am. I'm not going to be Charlie Parker. I'm not going to be anybody else. I'm going to be myself. But in order to get it together, I've got to start giving some thought to this. And I think at around age 50, things started coming together. So that meant I started at age 12 on the saxophone. What is that, 40 years?
Yeah, almost.
Almost fighting the saxophone, so to speak.
I think to solidify that for folks, it sounds like the way you've approached it is basically owning your instrument, owning everything that you could possibly do with your instrument. Sort of like, to use an analogy, how we learn how to speak, how we learn how to actually converse in our language. You could be seen as being very literate by how well you speak, not necessarily how well you read per se, but we learn language by listening first, and then we speak it, and then we learn how to read what we essentially have been saying, and then we learn more and more and more. It sounds to me that that's kind of the case with you, where you just really honed down with your instrument and really worked on like the foundational types of skills like scales, intervals, chords, modes, that kind of thing. Am I right?
Oh, yes. Yes, you definitely are right. And I tell you another thing I learned. Way back there, I was sitting in my desk where I'm sitting right now, and I just bought two new Electro Voice speakers. They were probably 15 inches tall and sounded great. And I had this Sonny Stitt record on, and he was playing something. And on about the third track, I detected that the phrase he just played, which was about a measure long or two, was in the same key as the phrase he played back on track one. So my brain thought, I caught Sonny Stitt. He's repeating himself. He can't think of anything new to play. So it's kind of like I chopped his head off in order to make myself a little taller. And then I sat there working at my desk, and the record's still playing, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. That can't, my thinking is flawed there. Let me think about this a second. So I stopped the record, and then I thought about it. I said, okay, now the second time he played it, did he sound like he had just found that idea, or did he sound like Jamey Aebersold sounds when he plays a phrase the second time and knows he's repeating what he just played 3 or 4 minutes before, and Jamey doesn't feel good about it because he hasn't come up with something new? And my answer was, well, no, the second time Sonny Stitt played that, he sounded like he just thought of that phrase and was excited about playing it. Bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, dum, bum. Jamey, did you just learn something there? Boy, I sure did. And I said to myself, okay, from now on, when I go out and do a clinic and I demonstrate the G major scale or the C major scale, I'm going to play that sucker like I just found it. No more of this just doing demonstration stuff and not having my heart in it 1,000%. And that was a big point. That was a big learning lesson for me, tremendous learning lesson. Now, if I'm playing a concert and I make a mistake in front of people, I laugh because I didn't play what I wanted to play. But so what? It's over. I'm not going to cry about it. And I may come back and try to play it again and see if I can get it right the next time. But it's a process of listening and trying to play exactly what I hear in my head, which I have finally accomplished.
That's incredible, because what you're essentially saying too, when we're performing on stage, you're, like you said, you're trying to play what you're hearing in your head. And if you make a mistake, so what? It's sort of like when someone gives a speech. It's not always 100% perfect, even if they're reading it. But the point is that you have this idea and you're trying to express it through your instrument. And it's awesome if it comes out the first shot, usually does. Sometimes it doesn't. That's okay. We're human beings, and it's okay to do that. And I think that's very freeing to a lot of folks that are listening to this, and studying your materials and stuff. I would think. I mean, just hearing that from you. But what I'm also getting out of this too is that it's, jazz is not something that you obviously learn overnight. It's not something that you can learn even in 3 months. It's a lifelong journey, and it's a lifelong journey with your instrument, with really owning, with really, I don't want to say mastering, because I don't think anybody will really master anything, but really getting better and better at being proficient on your instrument and being able to express yourself through your instrument. Would you agree?
I would totally agree. And in addition to what you're saying there, for a long time, I just didn't quite grasp 100% the importance of knowing my major scales, minor scales, dominant seventh scales, half diminished scales, diminished whole tone scales, this, that, and the other, and the arpeggios that go with them. I knew I should practice them, but I didn't have the discipline to do it. But now I have done it, I've thought it, I've fingered it, and I'm a big proponent of getting those scales and chords, because if you're going to play what you hear in your head and you start to sing a solo, you don't sing leap after leap after leap after leap, or you don't sing chromaticism after chromaticism after chromaticism. What you use is, what we humans use is bits and pieces of scales and bits and pieces of arpeggios, and filtered in with rest, repetition, articulation is very important, leaps, chromaticism, and space, and I think I said repetition, sequence. Those are the main elements. American jazz is made up from bits and pieces of scales and chords, and if you don't learn those, then you're going to be playing gibberish, and if you're really listening to what you're playing, and if I were sitting out there listening to it and I'm thinking, well, that's a bunch of gibberish. Now, if you don't realize you're playing gibberish, then you're in trouble, because you're never going to find yourself. The interesting thing about jazz, especially for young people, is if you're playing in a school, high school or something, everybody's going to clap every time you take a solo, regardless of what your solo sounds like. But I always, way back there, when I started teaching jazz to individual students, and then I had little combos in my very basement that I'm in right now, I told them every time, I said, look, okay, we're going to rehearse for an hour and a half. Let's play like Miles Davis and Sonny Rollins are sitting over there on the sofa, and they're listening to you all play. So we're going to play 100% on every solo, even if you don't know the scales and the chords, and you'll quickly learn that next week when you come back, you got to have these scales and chords under control, because they're required for this song that we're playing. It's as simple as that. But it took me a long time to get to the point where I could do that with myself.
That's great advice. And I'm just thinking, as you're saying this too, in the school systems today, it's so different from state to state and even from county to county. I know where I grew up, the public school system was strong with music in all of the districts, and many of the districts had really good jazz bands. In fact, Long Island is well known in New York State for producing amazing jazz musicians. When I moved to California, it was totally the opposite. In fact, a bunch of schools did not even have band programs, especially in the elementary schools. So it made it kind of tough. But what I'm thinking in my head, I encounter a lot of my own students privately from all over the world that don't have any kind of access to music education. And it's the saying, you don't know what you don't know.
Hmm.
So, yeah, let me ask you this question. How would you approach a beginner, maybe not a beginner player, maybe they played for a year or two or whatnot, but they don't have any kind of formal music education background? How would you guide them to exploring and learning, and loving jazz?
Well, I think it was 1989. I put out volume 21, which was before volume 24, which I know that you have promoted in major and minor. But I think if people would practice with volume 24 to start with, major and minor, and just put the first track on, a comfortable track, play the scale up and down, and then just try to improvise, that is a good start. And in addition to that, I know that today's band directors are overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So the band director's job, I think, is to direct a student to things like volume 24, volume 21, volume 1, and volume 54. Because if the band director is smart, the kid's going to learn a whole lot more at home than he can possibly learn in the band director, because the band director does not have time to give him individual attention. So way back there when I was starting, uh, I didn't even sign up for a band my sophomore year because they were marching and I didn't care for it. And I went back my junior year and senior year, and I was constantly at odds with the band director because he had been out with his violin playing on territory bands around the country, and he knew that was not a good life for young people. So he did anything with jazz, and I was jazz. Everybody knew I was interested in jazz. He didn't have anything to do with me, so to speak. I think he knew that I was a decent musician, but he just didn't like the idea of me being so involved in jazz. So me and my band director did not get together. But I quickly found out with the other band directors who were friendly to jazz and maybe even played themselves, I directed them to the play along records to give or have the student buy, practice at home, come in and maybe after band or before band for 10 minutes, play for the band director, and then he kind of directs their progress. But in today's world, boy, it's rough. When volume 21, Getting It Together, came out, it just so happened that I had the LPs, but I didn't have the book yet. Yes, I did have the book. Anyhow, the local junior high school, the band director's father was sick, so he let me take the band all week. I said, "Do you mind what we do?" He said, "No." So I took my record player over. I had this whole concert band, 8 percussionists, you know, 4 tubas, this, that, and the other. By the time we got to Friday, we were swinging through all 12 major scales, 4 bars apiece, up in half steps, that's track number 1, and down in half steps, track number 2. I had a few people that wanted to improvise. We had all kind of exercises written on the blackboard, and I'd point to them and they'd do them. My whole point in doing volume 21 and encouraging a band director in the school system to get it would be if they practice once a day at the beginning of every day on a 4-minute track, that after a month the kids would have more facility and he could buy better music, more advanced music for the kids, and hopefully along the way he would be able to hook more kids on to playing their instrument because they had more facility. Now, if they wanted to spend some time and learn how to improvise, great. That brings up another thing, if you don't mind me
Oh,
saying it
please.
right.
Yeah, please.
If they don't learn how to improvise, when they get out of high school, even though they maybe been through 6, 7, 8 years of band, they're probably not going to be playing their instrument because they need a music stand and you need some paper up there on it that someone else has written because they were not taught how to improvise. I was out at school that had about 200 string and band program and jazz. That was 2 weeks ago on a Monday. And I started off by saying, now most of you are not going to ever do what we're doing, which is we're playing songs that we've got memorized, and then we play across the harmony to that song without having any paper, any music in front of us. But you, the vast majority of you can't play Mary Had a Little Lamb without the music in front of you. So I asked them, how many of you out of 200 have tried to play Mary Had a Little Lamb or Old MacDonald or Happy Birthday or anything like that? I would say about 12 hands went up. Now that's 12 out of 200, which is not a very good percentage. And I told them, I said, the majority of you will not be playing your instrument 6 months after you graduate from high school because you haven't been taught how to improvise. So I'm a proponent of learning how to improvise.
I hear you. And I was going to say exactly what you just said in terms of people, dropping instruments. When I taught public school in New York, elementary, we had parent back to school night. The parents, I would talk to them about their kids, and I can't tell you how many times people would come up to me and say, "Oh yeah, I played flute when I was, in school, and I kind of stopped after high school because I didn't know what to play."
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like you become a slave to the black dots on the page. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the highest level of music, I feel, this is my own opinion, but the highest level of music literacy is not how well you read music, it's improvisation, because it's creativity on the spot.
Oh, of course it is. I mean, we're very creative and we improvise every day. I mean, the kid wakes up in the morning and he decides what shirt he's going to wear.
Yeah.
What pants am I going to wear? Am I going to wear my shoes? I'm going to do it. Go down to eat. Now we have a habit when it comes to eating, but what if something's missing? Well, you improvise and stick something else in there. Maybe you decide to stop by McDonald's and eat breakfast as opposed to eating at home. We're improvising all the time, all day long. But when it comes to music, so many of the vast majority, 99% of the people that play a musical instrument are chained to the written page. And I think that's very sad. I don't know how it's going to change, though. I don't know how it's going to change. Uh,
I think honestly, it's funny because you alluded to the story that you mentioned where you asked how many people know how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb or some simple songs. And I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Edwin Gordon. He created the music learning theory, and he actually turned it around for me because I had your books and all that kind of stuff, and I was teaching in schools and whatnot. But I had taken a course at Hart, University of Hart, over the summer. It was a continuing ed course for teachers, and it was all about creativity and improvisation. And the whole thing was this: it was how to use your ears. Really, we learned simple songs by ear, not just the melody. We learned the bass lines, we learned harmony parts, very basic harmony parts. We were singing a cappella, and then we were improvising rhythms on those, the notes of the chords as the chords change. We did simple 1/5s, 1/4/5s. um, and I get the musicality from when people walked in to when they went out was astronomically high. But what it did, it inspired me to change the way I taught in school. And then I got certified to teach music learning theory, which is essentially based around the concept of audiation. And that's to recall something, to hear something in your head that you may not have heard, 5 minutes ago. You may have heard it 5 years ago, but it's learning things by ear so that you internalize it, you own it. And then you learn how to read it, you learn how to write it down, all those types of things. And what you said about learning the simple songs is the first step. And that's what I do with a lot of my beginning students. And you had said, I don't know how we're going to change that. I think you are, by just bringing up that question, to these young students. I know as a teacher, yes, I was a band director. We were overwhelmed. And half the time I didn't see my kids because they were taken out for testing, or they were taking out for other services so that they could do better on the other tests as opposed to music. And I had less and less time with my kids. But the one thing that kept them there is I taught them how to play songs by ear so that they could do their own thing.
that's great. See, now you're one of the few people that are taking the time to do that. But that's exactly what people need to do. As a matter of fact, I told those 200 high school students, freshmen to senior, a couple of weeks ago, I said, we're going to play a tune now, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to close your eyes. And I could look out and see a couple of people giggling as they looked at the person next to them. I said, now I know some of you are giggling. I'm asking you to do something that you've maybe never done, and that is to listen to music with your ears and have your eyes completely shut.
Yeah.
You're used to watching music on your smartphone, your iPad, your Kindle, whatever, TV. I said, we, pointing to the musicians, the quartet that we had, I said, we all grew up listening to music and thinking about music. Even with our eyes open, we'd be working a job or cleaning your room or whatever, but we were listening intently to what was going on. You all have not grown up with that. You've got the music written in front of you, you play what's written, and you get a grade on it. But like I told you earlier, when you graduate, unless you learn how to improvise, you're not going to be playing your instrument. Unless you have maybe a church band you play with, or maybe by the time you get out, you've already started a little rock band or a jazz group. I said, but for the vast majority of the people that are in our school systems across America, music, improvise, playing your instrument does not follow you out the door when you graduate from high school. And it's tragic, I said.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is. And, I'm just thinking to myself too, we're talking about the music in public schools, but this also applies to folks that are adult beginners as well. I have a lot of private students that are adult beginners, many of them over 50, actually, most of them are, and a bunch of them over 70. And a lot of them have been saying, oh, I've always wanted to play an instrument, or I played an instrument in high school. I stopped for 50 years. I want to play again, and I want to learn how to improvise. And I think that, people are realizing, in a subconscious way, they're realizing that, oh my gosh, I wish I would have continued on my instrument. And really the key is, it's not how well you read. The key is how well you are fluent in your instrument, and that, that fluency can help lead you to being creative in improvisation.
Exactly. And once they start that process, even if it's just with Mary Had Little Lamb, for instance, if we're doing Mary Had Little Lamb, I'll say, okay, now let's all grab your instruments, get them out, and we're going to play Mary Had Little Lamb starting on concert E, okay? I
Mhm.
said, now here's the way I think about it. It's in the key of C, and I think of it as 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, 3, 5, 5. I said, how many of you have thought digitally numbers of scales? And a few people will raise their hand. Okay, but the majority of them have never thought digitally. I will say that David Baker, when I took lessons from him back in the early 60s, he had me thinking digitally, and in the beginning, I didn't. My brain was twisted, but I very quickly started using the left side of my brain, thinking about it, and the next thing you know, a Dorian minor scale was a major scale with a lowered third and lowered seventh. A melodic minor scale was a major scale with a lowered third. Things like that, and I'm thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sharp nines, flat nines, sharp fours, sharp fives. Everything became easier, and I could transfer that to my instrument. Maybe not in every key, because I'd be fumbling with the fingering, but I knew what I wanted, and that helped give me a lot of confidence. I don't think I was different than anybody else, because every time I made a mistake, I got upset with myself. I can remember I was probably 15, 16 years old, working on my dad's floors in the summertime. Had my Webcore record player out there blaring away, and I was listening to the Birdland All Stars, 1958. It was probably 1958, with Connie Condoli and so forth. And they're playing this Phil Woods on saxophone. And I hear this phrase, and I say, wow, let me run into the house, because our house was right next door to the florist. So I take my apron off and stop the record player, run into the house, take the record in there. I must have had a record player in there too. No, no, no. I'm just going, I've got the phrase in my brain. I go up to my bedroom, my sax is laying on the bed, I take the mouthpiece cap off. I get the first couple notes of the phrase, dee da doo dee, but I couldn't think where it went after that. So I play it again, and then finally I take the saxophone off on neck strap, and I slam it down on the bed, and I say, will I ever be able to play what I hear in my head? And then I go back out to the greenhouse and start watering the flowers or whatever I was doing, and listen to Phil Woods again. But I think the impatience right there, and the thought that I didn't get it the first time, set me back for a while. It made me think I couldn't do something. Had I stuck with it there another 30 seconds and worked that phrase out, don't you know I would have went back out to work on the floors and felt so good about myself, as opposed to feeling down.
Wow, that's a great story. And you said actually the magic word, impatience. It's what you're giving our listeners is, I'm going to use the word hope in a sense, because a lot of people feel that it is a mystery. And your mantra is that anyone can improvise, and you take the mystery out of improvisation. And you just illustrated a story about that, where you heard an awesome little snippet of a phrase from Phil Woods, and some of it's stuck in your head. That's the audiation part. And you started to figure out, but when it didn't happen, then the frustration, the humanness set in, and you said, oh, this is never going to happen. And I think it's so important for our listeners to hear that, especially from someone of your stature, that this, improvisation takes work, just like developing a great speech takes work, or working on a project at work takes work. It doesn't happen overnight. And I wonder, why people, maybe it's just the way society is today, where people think that, oh, that person, they didn't study that long. They just have this natural skill. And, why do I have to work so hard? Maybe it's just, social media, that everybody thinks that, you barely need to work on anything, and you'll be perfect. I don't know.
I agree with you, and I think that's a social media thing, and also the immediate gratification. Uh, wow, it's an uphill battle to change society and the way they think. But once you get over to an instrument, that instrument is not going to do anything unless you do it. You know, if you got your trumpet and you've been listening to whoever you've been listening to, you're not going to sound like that person unless you put a whole lot of work into it. And of course, the object is for the teacher to direct the student to find their own voice. In other words, the object is not to have the trumpet player sound like Miles Davis. That's impossible anyway. But once you give the encouragement to the student by way of their practice schedule and the listening assignments that you give them and the reason that you give them certain assignments, certain tunes to listen to, I think encourage people to keep their own personal quest going and maybe for a little while drop this ego thing, which is always comparing everything we play with somebody great on a record. So if you can resign yourself to being fairly satisfied with what you're doing and knowing that you're doing it 100%, you're doing the best you can, and keep in mind, tomorrow will be different and you'll sound better tomorrow. You'll have more knowledge, you'll have more skill, more facility, and your ears are going to hear. That's another thing. We've talked quite a bit about the audiation, and I have read from that fella. And when I read, is it Gordon? Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Is that right, Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I read him, and I thought he's a jazzer in his approach to getting those ears going, you know.
Yes.
Before we came out with all these books that I sell, these fake books and so forth, we had to learn the tunes by ear, and that was one of your questions. How are you able to memorize so many tunes? What advice would you give the beginners wanting to learn and memorize songs? Well, the first thing is to listen to the song that you want to learn and listen to it over and over and over. As a matter of fact, my camps are coming up, and I'll give this demonstration at each of the 2 weeks. I'll put up a transparency. I use overhead projectors, and I got hundreds of transparency. I'll put up a transparency of my old green Webcore portable record player with a radio. I'll show them a picture of that, so what it looks like. And then I'll hold up an LP record. How many of you have seen an LP record? The majority of the kids have not. I'll say, now, back then, these were $5, and they had about 22 minutes on each side. And here's what we jazzers would do. We'd go buy a record, we'd put it on the spindle, and we'd play that first side for 22 minutes. And when that ended, we'd walk over to it, turn the record over, and play the other side. And when that side was finished, we'd go turn the record over and play the first side again, another 22 minutes. And then we'd turn it over again. We would do this for a week, every day, over and over. And that became our jazz teacher. Now, are we thinking while we're doing this, what key is that first tune in? Or what was that phrase so-and-so played at the beginning of that, or at the ending of a certain track? No, we're probably not thinking that because we're not using our left side of our brain. We're just using the right side of the brain and enjoying this fantastic music. And in time, we'll get to the point where we think, wonder what that first tune, There Will Never Be Another You, what key is that? So you go to your instrument or the piano and try to find the key. You have no idea what the chords are or what scales are needed, but you're singing those solos over and over and over. That is missing today.
Yes. And you know what's very interesting? I'm so glad that we're talking about Dr. Edwin Gordon. Unfortunately, he recently passed away, but he was a jazzer. He played bass, the not the electric bass, the stand-up bass, I think with Gene Krupa. And his ideology, his music learning theory, really, it's really training jazz musicians. It's not even jazz musicians. It's people that can improvise, because improvisation is the highest level of music literacy. And yeah, the way we train people is, listen, like, let's say I'm teaching somebody Mary Had a Little Lamb. I'll sing it a million ways till Sunday. I'll play the basic piano accompaniment. I'll ask people to listen for different things each time, and I'll ask them to feel the rhythms and not just feel like the big beat, the main beat, feel the subdivision, the smaller beats. I'll ask them to move to it, move to the big beats, move to the small beats. What do you think the starting note is? How many different pitches do you hear in this tune? Is it major? Is it minor? And that's after a little while, after me exposing them to major and minor. And the way they learn also is, if I'm going to teach Mary Had a Little Lamb, well, I've got to expose them to minor tonal patterns or tunes in minor. And the only way that they're going to understand something that's in a duple meter, like 2/4 4/4, I expose them to triple meter. It's like 6/8 or 3/4, like a waltz.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, Dr. Edwin Gordon has been really monumental for me, changing my life and changing my students' lives as well. And it's just a simple thing, like you said before, for any age. You know, for a lot of adults, they feel like, oh, Mary Had Little Lamb, are you kidding me? That's embarrassing. But you could make Mary Had Little Lamb sound so hip and so awesome, and you could be so creative and create something amazing with that, and use that simple material, you know, to your own advantage.
You know, you made me think of volume 21, getting it together. So it's got 31 different tracks. The last two tracks are blues in F and blues in B flat, very, very slow. All the other tracks cover starting out with major. And the first track is major scales, 4 bars apiece going up in half steps. The second track is 4 bars apiece and major scales going down in half steps, etc. So I always do this in my theory class. I'll say, okay, we're going to play Drop the Needle on a record or Raise the Laser on a CD. I'm going to play either track 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I want you, if you think it's track 4, you put 4 fingers in front of your chest so other people can't see it. And I'll point to you and I'll say yes or no while this track is playing. So I'll say, here we go. Okay, and I'll play the second track, which is 4 bars of major going down in a half step. Very few people will get it right off the bat. But then hands will start to raise and they'll put up 2 fingers and I'll be saying yes, yes. And then I'll say to some, no, 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 yes, 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 no. Okay, I'll let it run for 30 seconds, 35 seconds, and I'll stop it. I'll say, how many think it was track 1? A couple of people raise their hand. Track 2, track 3, track 4. I said, okay, all of you that did 2 were right. And then I'll say, okay, now let's try another track. Remember, we're only doing tracks 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're looking at the tracks up on the screen. It says number 1, major scales up 4 bars apiece, etc. So I say, I'm pointing to it, and I say, now you picture which one it is. And I'll tell them I'm going to play another track. I'll play track 2 again.
Mm.
Everybody is stymied. Nobody raises their hand. Then some people say 3, some say 4, say 1, because I told them I was going to play a different track. And then some people will smile and put up 2. They suddenly heard that it's the same track I just played. This is the beginning of their musical journey right here, when they can ascertain by themselves, with no help from anybody else, what the harmony is to a song. So I've used that often, and I've had some people write me and say, Jamey, that volume 21 is great. I put that CD in my car, and I just fast forward a couple of tracks, and then try to figure out what is that root progression. You were talking about Mr. Gordon playing bass, and I do remember him saying he played with Gene Krupa and so forth. If you can hear that bass line, you're halfway there.
Yes.
And the next thing is to figure out, is it major or is it minor? And then you go from there. But volume 21, I think, has been an often overlooked play along of mine. I'm not sure why. I think possibly it just looks like it's too much work, you know, to go through every key and all these different things. That's too much work. I don't have time for that. So people don't buy it like they should.
You know, that's an interesting point, and I can say for myself too. I think I've overlooked it as well, because I know I start my students on volume 24, and then we go to volume 1. I know in New York, when we do, we have yearly NISMA festivals, and you can go. It's basically New York State School Music Association solo evaluation festivals, and you can play jazz stuff, and they use the Jamey Aebersold books for the improvisation component on there. And we'll use volume 1, we'll use the blues tracks and such. But yeah, you know, with volume 21, getting it together, it could be, I think it's the mindset of today where, oh, we've got to do work. You know, it's got to be work. And people don't want to do work. They want to just get right to playing the tunes. Yeah.
Well, something else I do with the volume 21. I demonstrate how to practice scales, and we do it as a class. So there might be 80 people with all their instruments, keyboard players playing the keyboard. I got amps on the side for the guitar and the bass, etc. So we got maybe 60, 70, 80 people, and we're all going to go be ba do da da do do dee da ba do boo da ba boo ba ba, and then we're going to go up a half step, and I've got it on the screen for them, and I encourage them to try and play by ear, even if they make mistakes. Well, once they get through a track or 2, and I let them rest their lips, I say, okay, now I'm going to improvise one time through this first track, 4 bars apiece, major scales going up in a half step, and you tell me if you think this sounds like an exercise. And I just solo. And of course, it doesn't sound like an exercise. It sounds like improvising. I say, this is where we're going. I want to hear you eventually, before we die. I'd like to hear you play through this track and make some music and not sound like an exercise like we just did. The exercise is preparatory work to get your fingers to find the right notes and to get your ears attuned to, for instance, the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. And get your ear attuned to when you're on a major scale, the fourth note of the scale can sound a little funny, you know, and you're probably not hearing that in your head. You're probably fingering it because you're looking at it on the screen or on the page. But the whole idea for me is to talk about the theory and then demonstrate it. Talk and demonstrate. And then in the limited time we have, which is, well, we have an hour and a half theory every day for 4 days, Monday through Thursday. And then we have an hour on Friday. But I mean, having everybody there at 8:30 in the morning, every day, 4 days in a row. Some of these people haven't gotten out of bed before noon, before they came to the camp. And they're probably staying up talking at night a lot, you know, and they're not getting a lot of sleep. But we accomplish a lot. That volume 21, I think, is extremely important if you want to be thorough and get to the point where you can actually begin to play what you hear in your head.
You know, I had a thought, and I wanted to ask you this question, and I didn't send this to you beforehand. A lot of folks that are students of mine, or even I just see on a lot of the Facebook forums, they have difficulty with, they call it timing. I call it steadiness of rhythms. And how would you approach helping those students? I know you're probably going to say something to the effect of listening, and that's what I would do, but I'm just curious as to how you would approach that.
So you're basically talking about how they place their eighth notes, for instance.
Yeah, yeah, the feeling that, you know, swinging, basically, feeling the timing, and, you know, like they'll want to learn a standard, like let's say Satin Doll, and if the groove is ba boo da boo bop ba doo bop, but they're not playing it with the groove. They're going ba boo da boo bop,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. And that's a hard one because, wow, it reminds me of being in China. I think I went there 2 or 3 times in the last 4, 5, 6 years, and they have an awful time with this.
Hmm.
They can't, they don't let their body move. And I've realized that when I come back to the States and then I do my camps, an awful lot of us that come to the camp as a student, they won't let their body move either. They can't tap their foot. They can't move their shoulders, can't move their head. There's a stiffness there. Maybe, I don't know if that comes from classical music or the early training where you're not supposed to move your body, or it looks funny to other people. I don't know. But I think what I try to do is by example. I take my saxophone, and if they're playing it too stiff, we'll stop and try to loosen it up. Make that first note a little longer, the second note shorter. Some of you are tonguing those notes. Do you realize that? Now, you don't want to do that because it sounds too stiff. And I also mention to them when they're not swinging, I say, look, 100 years ago, we didn't have electronics like we have the amps and stuff. So your tuba was your bass, and you got your trombone, your trumpet, clarinet, no flutes because you couldn't hear the flute anyway, and you got a bass drum and maybe a snare drum, you know, maybe a banjo playing on a parade down in New Orleans or somewhere. But as things changed and bebop came along and electricity came along, the way we treated our eighth notes, everything got a little more legato and not so staccato like marching music.
Mm.
So some of you are still playing your eighth notes, and you're supposed to be swinging, but you're playing them like a concert band, you know, and
Yeah.
that's why they don't sound right. So you're going to have to practice this, and I also encourage you to record yourself and listen to it back, and listen to it back as a bystander. Does that swing? Does that sound like Kenny Dorham or Sonny Stitt or Charlie Parker? Does it sound like the phrasing that I've heard so many jazz people play, or does it sound like it's more like a march? And if it sounds more like a march, then you're going to have to give some more thought to it. I should mention something else too. The Red Jazz Handbook. I don't know if you have that or not, but I give them out, and they're free to go all over the world. In there are 2 pages of Sonny Rollins articulation exercises. And I personally practiced those when I was about a sophomore in college. And it was the hardest thing I ever did. I practiced them for a month. I forced myself every day to practice like 10, 12 minutes on them. And I just hated doing it because I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it as fast as I wanted to do it. Do, 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 do. Maybe change the articulation. Do, da, do, do, da, do, 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 da, do, 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 da, do, do. Move that accent around. Oh, was that hard? But
Yeah.
after a month, I started to sound like a jazz player. So I always instruct people who are having trouble with this swinging feel to that page and tell them they're not going to get there overnight. But if they work on it a little every day and can keep comparing their articulation with what they hear on the record, here again, we're using our ears, you're going to make some progress, and you will gradually probably move into the jazz arena as it comes to the swing and the articulation feel.
And I of course use your red handbook, and I hand them out to students, which is a phenomenal resource. And thank you for reminding us of that piece of that. And folks, by the way, and I'll remind you again at the end of the podcast too. Whenever you make an order, or even if you don't make an order, if I'm correct, you can get that red handbook for free from Jamey's site, jazzbooks.com. It's a wealth of information in there. And I know in today's society, people tend to want things in bite-sized pieces or quickly, or they want, just 3 tips and then they're going to sound amazing or whatever. But really, I think the theme of this episode, folks, is that, people become amazing and they become fluent by putting in the work. And you don't have to think of it as hard work. I think if you add some fun to your practice, some visualization, I play trumpet and saxophones, and I studied with Vince Penzarella in New York. And he would always say to me, you have to, use visualization, use your imagination when you're practicing. Imagine that you're Maurice Andre. Imagine that you're Phil Smith. Or if you're playing jazz, imagine that you're Freddie Hubbard, that you're Clifford Brown. Put your imagination into things, and it won't feel like hard work. But what we're talking about is it's old school. It's going down to the basics.
Exactly, yeah. And if the people will listen to what you're saying, and especially the ones that are studying with you, I think they're going to make some progress. I was going to say something else too. Oh, another thing that I've noticed, and this is very important, but sometimes I think we as educators might think of this as being a little esoterical, and that your beginning student, meaning someone that's practicing jazz for 2 or 3 or 4 years, maybe it's out of their reach, and that is to utilize the bebop scale. Donna, I emailed you before we started this podcast a page, and you can take a look at it when we finish. And in there, I talk about the importance of the bebop scale. I wrote this a month ago when I was recuperating from this bypass surgery, and it just dawned on me that when people come to the camp, the vast majority of them, all ages, when they play their solo, it's gibberish. And the reason it's gibberish is, it could be several reasons, but one main reason I've noticed is they don't use the bebop scale. So a lot of their phrases end before they should end. Now they know they're playing, they know they're keeping their place, and they know that they're playing right notes. But I know, in listening to them, that they wouldn't sing that phrase if someone paid them to. So they're playing what is kind of automatic to their fingers. If they would make that automation incorporate that extra note of the bebop scale, it would help them move on to the jazz plateau, I think, a lot quicker. So this year, I'm emphasizing my teachers, please, even at the beginning level, if you're playing a blues, give them the tonic key, the bebop scale, and have them play a couple licks across it and see if it kind of infiltrates their brain and fingers. And maybe by the end of the week, when they play their tune on the concert, maybe they play Blue Bossa or A Song from My Father or Cantaloupe Island or Watermelon Man or Summertime or Autumn Leaves. Maybe they'll incorporate that bebop scale. And believe me, if I'm walking through the auditorium when they play that scale, I am going to stop and listen to them, because that is part and parcel of the jazz language, using that bebop scale.
And that's a priceless piece of information, and a great reminder for teachers, but also players as well. Let me ask you another question with regard to the blues. Okay, there's many ways of approaching the blues. Some folks approach the blues teaching it where they just teach you, the blues scale, and you play the notes of the blues scale for the entire blues, and that's how you learn it to start with. Other folks use the bebop scale, and they say learn the bebop scale for each of the, let's say it's a basic blues, like a 1-4-5 blues. Learn the bebop scale for those chords and use those notes only. How would you approach, how would you teach a beginner to learn the blues?
The very first thing I do is we play the first 3 notes. you know, 1, 2, 3, and then we'd lower the 3. 1, 2, lowered 3. That's assuming on the second bar you're going to the 4 chord down.
Right. Right.
I try to get them to hear the difference between, say we're in the key of C. I want to make sure they hit the E at the right time and go to E flat at the right time. I want them to hear that. So we probably play some licks across that over and over. And like you talked about playing the blues scale, I've always felt like that was an excellent approach for about 2 lessons or maybe 1 week. And then I'm sick and tired of it, you know. Plus,
Yeah.
their imagination seems to run dry. I'm always a fan of having the student play the scale that's being played behind them. And that the blues scale is kind of like wearing tennis shoes to everything you go to. You go to church, you wear tennis shoes, that's the blues scale. You go to a wedding, you wear tennis shoes, that's the blues scale. Play the blues in the key of B flat, and you play the B flat blues scale, and that's all you know. I think it's a mistake for the teacher to do that past about 2 weeks, okay? Then I suggest that they start playing, just like in the Red Book or Volume 1. Boo, play the first 2 notes. 1, 2, 1, do dee da, do dee da. Okay, next chorus, play the first 3 notes. Do do dee, do do dee, do do dee da, do do dee, do do dee, and then maybe try it. Do do dee, do do dee, boo do dee, be boo dee do da. Do do dee da do do dee. Just use a triad. There's about 9 sequences that I use. Play the first 2 notes, play the first 3 notes, play the first 5 notes, play the triad, the 7th chord, and the 9th chord, and then play the whole scale. That's 7 different things. If you do that over the slow blues, like on Volume 1, Track 7, and you practice that for a couple of days, I guarantee you it's going to give you information you can use the rest of your life. And when I come hear you play the blues, I doubt you're going to be playing gibberish, because you can tell when the chord moves from C7 to F7, and that E needs to be lowered to E flat, for instance, you know. I think David Baker was the one that told me, hey, Jamey, you're not playing, you don't know all the scales to this song. At that time, we were working on I Remember April and Stella by Starlight, which is not a beginning tune. But anyhow, I can remember being in college and driving home to Bloomington from Indianapolis saying, man, when I get home, I'm going over to the music building and I'm going to take Stella by Starlight. I'm going to play each scale up and down and each chord to the 9th. There are too many points in that song, parts of that song, that I just don't know what in the world to play. So I've got to get every scale and every chord under control. For playing the blues for the beginners, they have to do the same thing. And just like I've got my early Volume 1 book here, a couple of them, and I can tell in there where this was back in 1967, I took a pencil and I emphasized on the blues, the 3rd note of the scale and the 7th note of the scale for each measure. So that meant way back there, and I was 67, 39, 40, 50. I was almost 30 years old. I'm having to pencil in on a piece of paper the 3rd and the 7th in order for my brain to remember to play those notes when the blues goes by.
Yeah. And those are the pivotal notes too, you know, without a doubt. And I know, with all your series, you absolutely talk about that. But this is fantastic information for folks who, a lot of folks don't have access to a teacher. I do teach most of my students online, but some folks live in certain parts of the world where there's just not a good teacher around, and they're looking online, they're looking on YouTube, they're getting a lot of information, but it's not in a sequential way. And I think it's confusing people tremendously, because, they're starting to think, oh, I should be playing bebop. I want to play like Charlie Parker in 3 months.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny, but you're so true there. The idea of transcribing, which we haven't really talked about. I always thought I started transcribing, I don't know what age. I was in my 20s. Oh, when I started teaching here in New Albany privately. These kids didn't know the phrases, so I transcribed a whole lot of solos. I can't believe I had the time back there to do this, but I did, because I've got pages of them sitting over here on the shelf. Transcribing and loaning people at that stage of my life LPs. Go home. Here, take this record here by Lee Morgan. Take this record by Herbie Hancock. Oh, and this one here by Louis Armstrong. They go home, absorb that record, come back the next week. A lot of those people are now teaching college. As a matter of fact, some of them are getting near retirement, but they ended up being marvelous jazz players. And I always felt like they learned more away from my studio than in the basement. The basement was an opportunity to get together and play with other people and me make comments to them. But when they went away, they listened and they transcribed. So we haven't really talked about transcribing, but I used to say, well, if you're going to transcribe, why don't you start with a Stanley Turrentine blues solo like Sugar, something
Yeah.
like that, or Gene Ammons, a tenor saxophone solo, or even a Miles Davis solo on Kinda Blue where he doesn't play a whole lot of notes. And you stick with it until you get it. I say the hardest thing is going to be the rhythms. You can probably get the note heads pretty quickly, but then fixing the rhythms, if you're not used to doing this, can be difficult. But what you're going to learn from this experience is immeasurable, and it's going to help you the rest of your life.
When you ask people to transcribe, or when you have, I should say, do you have them first? Obviously, you're going to learn the whole thing by ear, or at least learn a chorus by ear. Do you also insist on them writing it down?
I don't necessarily insist they write it down unless they want to analyze it.
Oh, okay, okay,
You know, for instance, let's do this Chet Baker solo here on Summertime. He plays 2 choruses, so that's going to be 32 measures. Now, once you write it all down, I want you on a separate piece of paper to write down each time he takes a rest for at least a quarter note or an eighth, a beat and a half, then let's consider that to be a new phrase. Okay? What what does each of his phrases start in? Does he start on the root, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, or the eighth? What note of the scale does he start on? And then what about his ending notes of the phrases? Make a list, vertical list, or horizontal on a piece of paper. What note does he end his solo on? If the chord is C and he ends on a B, that's a 7, and you write a 7. Now, if he ends it on an F sharp, then you're going to write sharp 4 or plus 4. And you take a look and you can see how people are starting their phrases and ending their phrases pretty quickly. And that'll give you some information. Because I think a lot of people at the very early stage, they start on the root. And
yeah,
you have to nudge them to start on the third of the scale. And you have to nudge them again to start on the fifth. And like starting on the seventh or the sixth or the ninth is so difficult because their ear doesn't hear that. But if they force themselves to start on notes that are other than the root, the third, and the fifth, that'll give them some variety down the line. And then if they're busy listening when they're not practicing their records, they're going to hear that people are starting on all notes of the scale, and it gives you so much more variety.
yeah. And it's interesting. Someone had, I forgot who said this to me. People may think that jazz initially as beginners is like, oh, they just play whatever they want, but jazz really is about limits.
Oh
It's
yeah.
about, yeah, it's about limits. And in some ways that's more freeing, because if you have too many choices, it's overwhelming. And just your sequence, and I know this from the red book, the free red book that you get at jazzbooks.com. You go through that sequence, and even in the play alongs, and even in volume 1, going through that sequence, it's limiting you, but with limitations comes freedom.
Oh yeah. Exactly. The freedom is what we're looking for. I have several transparencies made out in red, white, and blue. It says freedom, and throughout the week I'll pop that on the screen as a reminder. This is what you're looking for, folks. Now, if you want the freedom, which I know you do, how many of you like freedom? Well, everybody likes freedom. Okay, then you need to learn your scales. Now, and if you're playing on the first 3 tracks to volume 1, F minor, 8 bars, E flat minor, 8 bars, and D minor, 8 bars, if you don't know those 3 Dorian minor scales, now you can sing to it and you'll sound great. But as soon as you pick up your instrument, you're going to start on the note F, probably concert, and you're probably going to go up. How about starting on C and coming down? I give them a lot of options in the volume 1 book. Something else I do at my camp too. As a matter of fact, people that have come for many, many years, when we have our first 10 o'clock session, jazz musicianship that I do for an hour every day, they'll sit up on the front row because they want to raise their hand when I say, I need a volunteer. Boom, and their hand will go up.
Hmm.
They want to come up on the stage and sing with the microphone while I sit at the piano and play a very random bossa nova. Now it's random chords, but it's logical. And I say, now you just sing. You can use you can say la 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 or whatever you want, and they'll sing a beautiful solo. And I'll modulate through different keys, 2-5-1s in minor, this, that, and the other. Everything's slow, and their voice goes right with me. I stop, and 300 people applaud. Okay, I
Hmm.
say, well, that was really great. Could you do that on your instrument? Oh, no, no, not at all. I said, well, I wonder why you can't do that. Well, I wouldn't know where the notes are. Well, how can your mind and your voice follow this intricate chord progression I just played, but yet you can't play it on your instrument? Well, the obvious answer is I don't have my instrument under control. So I use that once a week to show them that everybody's got music in them. Everybody's got music in them. It could be the custodian, you know. It could be the guy painting the lockers in the down in the band room. You don't have to be a musician. Just sing right notes. It's the easiest thing in the world. But as soon as you pick up your instrument, you're confined to a note. And is that note part of the scale or the chord or not? And if it's not, the first thing that comes up is, I knew I couldn't do this. He's embarrassing me. This is terrible. I'm going to quit. I knew I couldn't do this. Why am I taking these lessons from Donna and wasting my money? I can't do this.
Yeah.
I'm going to take my Aebersold CDs and books and burn them. This is not for me. I can't do this. You're in a constant battle with your ego, I feel. And it's up and down, up and down, up and down, until you get to the point where you start to actually, when you start to play, you know what that note's going to sound like, you know the rhythm you want to use, and you know what the articulation you're going to use to start that very first note of a phrase that's probably going to have 16 or 20 notes in it. You know, I always tell them playing jazz is just like talking, except you're using notes. And the problem is you don't know where the notes are on your instrument. It's that simple. You're not familiar with your instrument. Once you get familiar with the instrument, over, say, the blues, or the first track to volume 1, or the first track to volume 24, where you're just staying on one scale, and you gain a little confidence, you realize you can do this, you know? That's why some people, incidentally, have coming back to the camp this year will be the 25th and 27th year for 2 people from Colorado.
Wow.
In a row.
Oh my gosh.
Always joke and say, these guys are really slow learners. That's another thing that you have to incorporate, and I'm sure you do too. Humor. I've got all these transparencies of musician jokes, and I put them up every now and then when I feel like things are getting too heavy and their brain is just about ready to twist. And sometimes we Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at night at 7:30, we have 3 groups, faculty groups play, and there's usually a 5, 6, 7, 8 minute span of time where there's nothing to do while the second group sets up in the third group. So I've taken to reading some jokes that I got off the internet, jazz jokes and musician jokes. And it's great how it loosens everybody up. They're all laughing, and it makes them forget they're at jazz camp and they don't play nearly as well as the people on the stage. But who cares? We're having fun.
Yeah, and oh my God, there's so many things that you said there that was really amazing. And one of the key points that we haven't talked about really is ego, and it's how the ego plays such a huge part in oh my gosh, everything. I mean, one of the words that a lot of my students throw around is confidence. Feeling confident in what they're playing. Not looking foolish.
Yep.
There's so much ego involved with improvisation, and it really, when you think of it, it really shouldn't be.
No, it shouldn't be. And I have a sheet which I haven't used in a while, but I can't remember what does it say. It's got about 15 words on it, and all of them apply. All of them infer that jazz players have these abilities, and that's why they play so well, and they are special. And then I throw that all out the window. I say none of this is true. I said these people have practiced like crazy. You just don't know it. When's the last time you heard Stanley Turrentine, or Dexter Gordon, or Wynton Marsalis, or Freddie Hubbard, or anybody talk about how long they practiced as a kid in order to get to the stage that they're at? Yeah. They don't. As a matter of fact, in the old days, they didn't talk about that at all because they felt like they kind of had something special, which they did because they practiced. And I guess maybe in a way they wanted to keep themselves kind of up on the totem pole, up high. I'm so-and-so, and I'm better than everybody else. Here I am doing a clinic for 100 kids at a college or something and being paid good money to do it. I'm going to keep myself up on that totem pole. The last thing I'm going to tell them probably is how long I practiced when I was their age, which could have been 8 hours a day. Yeah. But I think if that information were let out, like that cassette of Charlie Parker telling Paul Desmond that he practiced 11 to 15 hours a day for 3 to 4 years, that changed my life. That changed my life. That said, okay, all I got to do is practice if I want that goal of playing like Charlie Parker. Of course, I won't play like him. I'll play similarly to him, and I'll be myself. And I obviously have not attained that goal, but I'm very happy with playing now because I know so much more than I knew when I was so young. And I can't believe it took me so long to learn, but I was just a slow learner.
and the interesting thing too is that one of the great things that you've done is you've taken some of the so I'll call it struggles or whatever in your own life, and you've helped thousands of people all over the world appreciate, learn jazz, but more importantly, help them realize that, yeah, they can improvise. And whether it's, just over three notes or over a complex bebop tune at, quarter equals 240, they can do it, and I give you, kudos, credit, all that kind of stuff. And thank you for doing that. And what I want to ask you a couple more questions before we go. I appreciate your time. We were talking beforehand, and I've kind of read this in a couple of places. Is it really true that this is the last year of your summer camp?
I think this is going to be my last year, yes. Like I mentioned several times, I had this open heart surgery, double bypass, which I was totally shocked with back on April the 5th. Yeah. I didn't have any pain or anything, but for 5 months prior to that, starting back in November, I had zero energy. The last thing I wanted to do was to play my saxophone. The last thing I wanted to do was to listen to music. All I wanted to do was sleep. They even had to hear, we have a Carnegie Center for Art and History in New Orleans. It used to be a Carnegie Library. And it's every 2 months they have a different exhibit. And just so happened on December the 8th, they had an exhibit called Jamey Aebersold, The Improvised Life. Well, leading up to that, through August, September, October, and so forth, I was really into it, and it was wearing me down, getting the stuff together for it. And they decorated all these rooms with stuff from my room and my basement here. Anyhow, during that time, the last thing I wanted to do was go down and smile and talk to some third graders from Fairmont High School or Fairmont Elementary School here in New Albany. I mean, I wanted to be there, but I didn't have any energy. So to answer your question, when we got up into probably March, a fella called, like I said earlier, and he asked me if it was going to be last year, and my wife said yes, and then I said yes, because I felt like the Dickens. I felt terrible. But now that I feel better, I don't think I'll change my decision. I think this will be it. I'll probably still maybe I'll do some more 2-day workshops where I work just by myself. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm into my 9th week of recovery, and when we get through talking, I'm going out to the hospital for rehab for my body. I don't know what I'm going to feel like when the 2 weeks is over. Right now, I'm just getting ready for the first 2 weeks of July I'm reaching up for something. For the 652 people that we currently have enrolled for 2 weeks.
Wow.
Can you believe that we have 35 drummers the first week?
Oh my God.
We have 47 piano players and 20 on a waiting list. We have 33 guitars the first week and 30 on the waiting list. Wow. Saxophones, 86 the first week, 108 the second week. Trombones, the instrument that nobody plays, 22 and 32. Wow. Incredible. Clarinets, vibes, organ, flute, voice, you name it. We've got bass, 32 bass players the first week, 29 the second. Incredible. Yeah. But I'm going to just wait till I get through it. If I live through it, which I'm forward to it, then I'll plan the next stage. By then I'll be almost 79. I tell you one thing I regret though is hurting my rotor cuff, my right arm, and I can't shoot those 3-pointers like Steph Curry anymore.
I had read that you were able to sink 50 free throws in a row.
53.
53. Wow, that's awesome. That's incredible.
26 3-pointers, and wow. Yeah, I just love shooting basketball. As a matter of fact, I'm going tonight to New Albany High School gym at 7 o'clock to see a fellow named Romeo Langford. He's like number 5 in the nation. He's a senior. He's going to go to IU, but they're already talking about him for going to the NBA next year, if you can believe that. Wow. That's I haven't met him. I'm going to take my video camera tonight and video the game. Yeah, I love basketball. I equate basketball and playing jazz to be very, very similar, because in basketball, you come down the court, say you're playing 3-on-3 or 5-on-5. You don't know exactly what's going to go on. Yeah. But you get down there and the people start to move, and they move in this direction and the other direction, and somebody who was open and you could pass the ball to them, all of a sudden they're not open, and then the clock is going down. You got to do this. So I've always thought of playing basketball as being very similar to improvisation. But, if you don't know how to dribble the ball, you can't even get down the floor. And if the basket's too far away and you're not used to shooting 3-pointers, which is what I always shot, then you're not going to score. You have to be prepared is what I'm getting to. And to close this, I just want to emphasize the importance of the scales and the chords. and the articulation, like you were talking about the swing part of things. Like Duke Ellington or somebody said, it doesn't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Uh, the music evolved over the years from being marching like, and it got very smooth. And as soon as electronics came in and made the upright bass and the guitar smoother and not so staccato, I feel like the articulation on the horns, the saxes and the trumpets, they kind of followed that pattern. And we've been there for a long time, which I think is good. I like that. So I want to say goodbye to all of your listeners, and I appreciate the time that you've taken with me, Donna. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I want you to email me your address.
I definitely will. And I wanted to thank you so much. This has been so valuable to my listeners and myself. And I'm just so honored to have you on. Thanks so much, Jamey.
All righty. Thank you, Donna.